You usually
That,
take
that,
your.
like when I say the things before
All right.
No, I
Well,
find it.
welcome back to class, everybody. This is our next session here, and we're going to be doing Old Testament Survey 3, the Book of the Writings. Okay, so this isn't going to work again, okay? All right, we'll do it the old way again. Okay, so again, it's going to be the writings. Um, One of the things I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on during this particular semester is the timeline, because what we've got in this particular group of books goes from way at the beginning until the exile and the return, the various books. So as we get into each one, we'll mention it, but we're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about the timeline. It'll become pretty apparent when we're studying it what the timeline is. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. If you look at in your books, we might as well just cover some of the the details of what's required. I'm sure everybody's been through all this many times, so but just for the formality, and in case anybody's online that didn't go through this before, I think it's on page 3 of the book. It just goes over the course requirements. Obviously, complete the review sections, complete the reading plan, which we'll talk about in a minute. Got to pass the final exam and submit an essay. And the essay, descriptions in there, again, it's basically taking what you've seen here, pick one of the books, and then figure out how it applies to your life and what they did. There's a description there. I'm not going to try to add anything to it or anything else. It'll just be what it is there. Again, it's a 600 to 900 word essay. Sounds like it's very similar to what you did this past semester, so it should be real familiar. Okay, and if you go over to page 4, you'll see the reading plan. You got Psalm, you got the Song of Solomon, and then Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. Then we get Ruth, Esther, and Daniel, Lamentations, and then First Chronicles. For week 6, you get Second Chronicles, and then week 7, it's Ezra and Nehemiah. And as I think it reminds you in there, you don't really need to get too awful detailed in the reading, but it's good just to read it so you'll recognize things when we talk about it in class. But because of the amount of reading, just like last time, you're not going to have time to, probably, unless you're not working or you got more time than I have to go in and just go line by line and really do a full hermeneutic on everything. Okay, we'll go to the lesson outline now. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so this is the outline of what we'll be doing. So as we're doing something a little bit different than we have in the past, I think, where we had like just an introduction where we kind of just talked about the overall thing. Today we're kind of combining things, doing the introduction and this first lesson at the same time. So the first lesson is what are the writings. Lessons 2 and 3 are the books of poetry. Be Psalms, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Then we get to the writings about women. One thing you'll notice in this particular course is they've organized things a little bit differently than, say, the Hebrew canon, which has some different names for things. So they've arranged it a little bit differently for this class. So the writings about women, that's obviously Ruth and Esther. Then we go into the period of the exile with Daniel and Lamentations, and then the period of the return with First and Second Chronicles, and then continuing during that period with Ezra and Nehemiah. And then lesson 8 will be our review, getting ready for lesson 9, which is the final. Okay, I just actually duplicated the reading plan in the slides here, so it's in your book also. Okay, so if we look at what we're going through here, kind of a quick review. In Old Testament 1, you looked at the books that were part of the law and the Torah. And then just a few weeks ago, we finished up Old Testament 2, which was the books of the prophets. So now we're going to be looking at the ones they call the writings. Some people call them, historical books too. There's other ways to refer to them. Basically, these are divided into three general categories. Again, it's the poetical ones, the writings about the women, and then the writings of the exile and the return. Now, one thing that's different about these books than, say, the prophets or even the law and the Torah is the previous times the books have been concentrating a lot on history and what's going on with Israel, kind of an overall, the whole nation type thing. I mean, you'll find some personal stories in there, but these books are definitely more personal, they're more reflective. You will find some parallels with what we've just studied, especially as we get into the part about the exile and the return. You'll definitely see some parallels there because this was all going on at the same time. And sometimes they were even, some of these were even mentioned as, well, we'll see this in, when we look at that type thing. Or we'll go back to those books to see, where, say, Ezra and Nehemiah is fitting into the picture. But the big thing is these things are real personal. And what I'm hoping to do, and I'm get your input maybe to help me do this, but because these books are a lot more personal, I'd like to try to see if we can find a way to make this more personal rather than just sitting up here and giving the facts that are in the book and etc. I'm hoping maybe I can come up with a way to do some discussions, maybe some other things that we can come up with to try to help make it a little bit more personal and get it so that we can figure out how this really applies to us. A couple technological things I got in mind. If maybe we can facilitate like a discussion, even while we're here, and then record it so that the people offline can at least hear the type of things we were discussing. Still working on the details on that one. Okay, so now let's just take a look at these poetical books. Now, as we said, these books are a lot more personal than we've had before. And the way to look at this, I think, is to take a look at David. If we look at what we saw in Samuel, he gives kind of the history of what was going on with David. He goes, all the way from when David was first serving under Saul to when he became king, to the problems he had, and then how he finally ended up, and then, moving on to Solomon. If we look in the book of Acts, that's where we find out, that it says that, he's a man after God's own heart. But it's in the book of Psalms is where we find out really what that means for him to be called a man after God's own heart. You'll see him as we go through all these Psalms, at least the ones that he wrote, obviously. You'll see him crying out to God. You'll see him being angry at God. You'll see him praying to God. You'll see him repenting. And you'll just see basically, a whole range of human emotion that he expresses in these different Psalms as he writes them. And that's kind of the thing we really want to look at here. And I think that's what we can really take out of, for our lives and also to those that we're ministering to. Because I know, out in the motels, a lot of people are out there, thinking, gee, I've done all these nasty things and, God can never want me, and sometimes I just really get mad at God and, I can't be good. He's going to, zap me with a lightning bolt or something for getting mad at him. I think if we look at things like this and we look at David and some of these other Psalms, we can see, yeah, here's a man after God's own heart, and he was doing all these things. He did a lot of bad things too. And God still called him a man after his own heart. And we can see why. So that's the kind of things I'm hoping we can get out of these as we're going through them. And then you look even at, Solomon's another good example. In the books we've looked at, we see all the history and et cetera, et cetera. But it's hard to get a lot more personal and intimate than the Song of Solomon. That's a pretty intimate book. And actually, since it's called Song of Solomon, that kind of leads into our chart here on the slide, that there's three different types of poetry. One thing I did notice is in the book, it has Song of Solomon listed as dramatic on this one, but when it goes into the chapter where it talks about it, it says it's lyrical. And everything else I've looked at says that it's lyrical. So I think we need to make that change on this sheet in your books. So the lyrical types of the poetic books, those basically are the ones that are made to be accompanied by music. You might even see in a lot of the Psalms as you're reading them, it might say, you know, for the director of music, or to be played on a harp, or whatever. There's definitely some things in there, and there's the word you'll see a Selah in there, which a lot of people don't. We really don't know exactly what it means, but it seems to be something related to the way the music was done. Some of the theories I've heard, anyway.
Is that like there's a group called Selah, and it's a lot of drums, and is that what you mean by the style of the music?
Well, nobody's really exactly sure what it means, but there's, you know, it's usually like in a break in between parts of the psalm. It'll say Selah, and we don't really know what it means, but something that got lost through history, I guess, you know, as far as the exact details of it. But the speculation is it was trying to tell them to do something. Okay, then you've got the didactic, which convey the instructions to live by. And then there's the dramatic, which communicates a message. So these are going to be actually the first ones we get into. So that's going to get kind of interesting, I think, to see how we do that, especially if we have any poets among us. I don't know if anybody here is really into poetry, but it might be interesting for, you know, somebody that's a modern day poet to kind of look at this, because the other thing is the Jewish version of poetry is not really what we think about poetry. I mean, we think of, you know, rhyme and rhythm, and they have a lot of other different constructs. They have a lot of things where they'll either repeat things, and that'll be part of their poetry, or they'll have, you know, something, and then they'll have just the opposite of it. They have definitely, it's a different way of looking at the poetry that they do. Okay. Okay, first it wouldn't do it, now it did too many. Okay. You know, technical glitch. It went too many, but anyhow, forget what's on the screen at the moment. We'll be looking at the writings about women. Obviously, there's two books here that we'll be looking at as we go about it. It's Ruth and Esther. Ruth was actually occurring during the time of the Judges. So this is a little bit earlier. Be right at the beginning of what we studied last time. And actually, she's a woman in the lineage of Jesus. Yeah, it's something happened and didn't want to do it, so. Yeah, it's my computer being weird. And then we have Esther. And this occurred during the time of the return and the remnant. And this is a case where we've got a woman who took a big risk in order to save her people, Israel. She was actually, you know, she was a queen in the Persian court. And she took this big risk that could very easily have gotten her killed on the spot. But she took that and saved Israel basically from elimination. They were planning on going out and just wiping them all out. And she managed to convince the king not to do that. So that's going to be another interesting study. And then finally, we have what's actually up on the screen. We'll be looking at the writings of the exile and the return. We'll be looking at Daniel. You know, I remember last time we were all kind of puzzled as to why it wasn't in with all the prophets stuff, because there's so much prophetic in Daniel. And that's the other thing about these books, which this brings a good time to bring up, you know, because they're intimate and personal is one thing, but they also can convey history and or prophecy. But they do it in such a different way. That's why they've got them separated into this instead of, say, putting Daniel in with the books of the prophets. So Daniel's looking more at the, at the future of Israel, and since not everything in his book has been fulfilled, our future too. And that could be I think that's going to be another real interesting one, because anytime you get to talking about, Daniel, you usually get a lot of discussion. That might actually be one of the best times for us to try to do some of these, group discussion type things. Then we get into the Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And this basically is, the reminder of all God has done for the people. Chronicles was written during this time. A lot of it is what you'll see in, Samuel and the Kings and etc. A lot of it's very similar. But this was written during the time so that the people that were in this exile, the ones that remained up in Persia, and the ones that actually came back down, to Jerusalem, so they'd kind of know what was going on and the whole history of things, and reminding them of everything God had done for them. And you'll also see a lot of parallels as we get into this era here between the prophetic books that we just studied last semester. So that's basically kind of a quick overview of where we're going with this particular semester. So next week we actually be getting into the meat of it, and we'll be starting with Psalms. Any questions about what we're going to be doing this time, or? All right, I guess we'll take a break while Paul gets set up, and then we'll move on to Christology.